Yeah, I know. So my Java client is getting.
So, can you do me a favor? So if I sit here, I can bother both the verso and Sorry? Okay. We're against tactics.
I figured I needed to. I figured that the second dispatch will cover. No, I can say it's. It doesn't make me just Q&A section. Like that, and like.
To his twice now, and yeah, it was relevant. So it's good. Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. I'm glad I could help somebody.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we both have the same objective. It's whether I can help her solve it, but at least there's two people trying to solve the same thing.
It's just yeah,
It's a good gig if you get it.
make that transition.
Props to you.
Transition to
Yeah.
make. I think you've been down that road.
I can save her wasting some time, but
Yeah. So thank you.
So definitely. I've got a lot of taking pictures. That was a good discussion, actually. And I do appreciate your I was just talking. They just keep bringing it. All right, I think we're going to get started.
There we go. All right. Thank you for coming to the Media Operations BOF. My name is Leslie Daigle, co-chairing with Glendine. The blue sheets are now in circulation. Please do fill them out. And in the meantime, please note well, standard note well for IETF activities. I'll give you a moment to read it all. I will not sing it. If you want it sung, you need to go to a different BOF. All right. This is our agenda for today. It's pretty much, well, it is the same as the one that is posted in the meeting materials. We have a Jabber Scribe, Matt Stock, and Kyle Rose has been volunteered to take notes. Thank you, Kyle. Thank you, Matt. Any particular bashes to the agenda at this point? Everybody ready to go? All right. So by way of introduction, just the purpose of this particular BOF is to highlight that there are many existing video activities ongoing in the IETF, as well as many activities ongoing outside of the IETF using IETF technologies to do video stuff. And aware of these facts and having seen some sort of cross-pollination and failure to cross-pollinate over the years, we in the group of interested parties here have for a while been proposing that there should be some kind of an IETF activity wherein we could identify a core group of IETF participants working on video activities, as well as some particular topics that we might want to work on in an ongoing fashion. So today, challenges include the fact that those activities really cover an awful lot of IETF areas. There is no one specific area where all the work gets done. It's everything from transport to art to int and everywhere else. And so there's no clear single home for it, which is why we've landed here today in an effort to try to coordinate some of those discussions and highlight where there are issues. It started to sound a little bit like maybe an operational issue, or at least it's operational issues that are driving this discussion. So perhaps there's scope for an operations working group. So the hope today is to do enough work to demonstrate whether or not there is interest here in the IETF and whether or not we have clarity to launch a working group or some other formal type of group to cover these topics. And I've included at the end of the session some discussion of the draft charter that we've been circulating for a few months now. So hopefully we will get to that and have a useful discussion there. But in order to give sort of an overview and understanding of the kinds of things we're talking about, we're first going to step through some substantive material, both in terms of work that's being done in other organizations that touches on the work here, plus also some of the open questions. So at this point, are there any questions or thoughts before we get into it? Everybody had a good lunch and ready for an afternoon nap? Alrighty then. Okay, so I think we are starting with you.
Hi, everybody. I'm Glendine from Comcast NBC Universal. Oh, I didn't want to boom into your ears and wake you guys all. I'm Glendine from Comcast NBC Universal. And Leslie's just going to pull the presentation up here. Closer? Even closer? Oh my gosh. Okay. I will be loud. I'm Glendine from Comcast NBC Universal once again. And we're just waiting. No pressure. I didn't say I did. Exactly. I think they're up in the. I think they're up in the browser. The tabs are already pre-opened. the phone. And then go to the tabs. No, no, it's something. Get rid of that. Click on that. We found it. So I'm going to do a sort of a historical context setting for some of this stuff. And there's two things I'm going to show, two simple slides. The first one is this. There's a draft. If you go to the data tracker for this BOF, there's a draft that sort of has the detail here. But I wanted to bring attention to the room to some work done over at SMPTE. SMPTE is a Society of Motion Picture and Television Engineers. These guys do professional video. And for the last while, they've been really hard at work on defining their transition plan to IP networks. And of course, essentially what that means is that they're converting all the stuff they do, which used to use other transfer technologies, into IP-based stuff that's all dependent upon IETF RFCs. And so what you're going to find there, if you go look at that draft, it's just a normative list of the top level stuff they depend upon. And of course, below all of those references, there's references and references and references. The takeaway here is that this is the tip of the iceberg, but the professional video guys are moving to being built on top of, for everything they do, on top of IP networks. And as such, what they're discovering is that there's a lot of things that work really well that we've done here at the IETF. And there's a few things sometimes that are little rough edges. And so part of the historic past here has been bringing some of that experience operationally from those rough edges back into the IETF as lessons learned and turning them back into feedback and comments and new work for various working groups. And it's a very broad set of working groups. Transport, routing, addressing, security, time has been stuff that they've all recently been interested in touching. So part of the thing that somewhat motivated getting us here today is work like this that was constantly popping back up and saying, well, there's things that are coming in from this space, video on IP networks, that are important and of interest to the IETF and potentially new work. I want the other one too, please. So these are sort of historical detritus that I'm showing you right now. So the other one that Leslie's working on right now is, for the last several years now, there's been a group of people that have been meeting at a regular side meeting at every IETF as we've traveled the globe and doing our meetings. And this is just a chart of the attendance here. And the takeaway from this is that there's a lot of sort of interest there from both individuals, but also from different organizations. So the blue bars here are the number of people that went to these side meetings regularly. And the orange bar is the number of organizations that were represented at that particular meeting. There's a few data points missing there because we didn't record very well. But the takeaway here also is back at IETF 98, we decided to hold a little BOF where we said, hey, if you're interested in video at the IETF, come meet us at this bar over in Chicago. While we were all there. And I put that out on the list of attendees at about 7 p.m. on Friday. By midday Saturday, I discovered there were so many people that stopped me in the hallway and said, that's an important topic to me. I want to talk to you about it. That we realized we wouldn't be able to go to the bar we were going to go to. So we ended up in a bigger room. The bigger room held about 70 people. In the end, we were in the room, we filled the room to capacity. They were streaming out into the hallway. And a rough head count at the time said we had about 10% of the IETF attendees at that IETF 98 were trying to get into that BOF just to talk about the topic of video. So a lot of passion there. In the end, 62 people successfully actually were able to get their name on the blue sheet, but we had a lot more going on. One of the lessons we took away from that first attempt to sort of say, are people interested, was that there was a lot of people interested, but we needed to sort of concentrate the conversation down a little bit to get organized and get our heads around some of the topic space. And so we told people, well, there's this other mailing list we had, GG at IETF. If you're interested, go sign up to that. And that's where we're going to put out the call for more ongoing video interest group side meetings. And so we did that, and we ended up into this smaller group, which we didn't advertise widely, but we didn't hide it either. But it allowed us to spend time talking about, where are we going, and it ended up that there was a series of presentations people came in and started doing as a regular part of this side meeting that went really well. Those, in fact, are archived. If you go to our meeting materials, there's a pointer over to where we have stored them on the web. The minutes are there and the presentations are there, so you can sort of see the history here as well. But that's my bit.
Okay, and I think Sanjay, you're next.
Yeah, just the front and back buttons.
All right, thank you. Good afternoon. My name is Sanjay Mishra. So I start this presentation talking about an industry consortium, but more so from the point of view that what happens in IETF does not stay in IETF. It actually goes out in the real world for some real world implementations, specifically focusing on the internet community. And by the same token, the work that goes out into the real world, there are implementations in the real world that actually may have feedback into the IETF based on using the standardization work and based on what the real world implementation is teaching, and some of that may actually come back into the IETF. So the intent here is to kind of give you an example of one such symbiotic relationship of where we take the work from IETF and then potentially look to feed back into the IETF. All right, so that said, let me just kind of walk you through with one such example of what I just said. So the Streaming Video Alliance is really is an ecosystem really focusing on single aspect of addressing the over-the-top streaming at scale. And then within the SVA, there are several different working groups, but I'm just talking about only one working group here right now, which is the Open Caching Working Group. And the Open Caching Working Group is primarily focused on interoperability amongst various players. That includes the content providers, commercial CDNs, technology vendors, and the internet service providers, basically to try to address the issue of delivery of the video. And that, of course, with the goal of improving the overall latency and also the QoE as well. So from the implementation point of view, what is Open Caching doing? So Open Caching started its work primarily rooted in the CDNI RFCs. And really the analogy that I can drive here is that Open Caching is really a special case of CDNI, where you have CDNI defines basically an upstream CDN and a downstream CDN, and defines the protocols that allows the two CDNs to be able to communicate. So really the Open Caching is in a special case in the sense that Open Caching is the downstream CDN, and any entity that is delegating content to it is an upstream CDN. So a little bit more of it in the next slide. So I talked about interoperability. So really the Open Caching compliant solutions, they're not only based on the CDNI RFCs, but based on the real world implementation. There's also a feedback into the CDNI working group that, hey, we've done implementation based on CDNI. RFCs, but we also see areas of improvement where we can feed back into the IETF. Now, in this particular case, the feedback mechanism was fairly straightforward in the sense that we've taken the RFCs from CD&I working group and then identified areas within those RFCs where we think there are improvements so we can feed them back. Well, there was a very straightforward process in terms of knowing where to go back to. But sometimes that may not be the case as to not knowing where we need to go back to. So really, if you look at, just as a quick example, basically there are 2 drafts in the IETF right now in the CD&I working group that feed back into the process. One is basically RFC 8008 and the other one is RFC 8007. And I've listed some of the features that we have identified and have drafted them back into the working group, such as defining new objects for dynamic footprint advertisements and also allowing a mechanism for the UCDN to be able to publish its feedback, its fallback address so, to avoid the loopback. And also on the CDNI interface and triggers, there are a bunch of enhancements that make the protocol much more agile in terms of what functionality you can add to it. And you can read the drafts in the, there should have been a link in the draft. Anyway, you can look up these drafts in the working group. So having said that, so in this case, we clearly see interoperability and we know where the feedback is, but sometimes that may not be very clear. So within the open caching working group, we have a very clearly defined path and we know some of the feedback that we can provide to. And we're also looking at additional opportunities where we know we can leverage the work which is going on in the IETF in certain working groups. HTTP-BIS is one of the working group that we see a couple of work items there that are very applicable to open caching, and we're going to be looking at lifting and reusing as much work as we can. There's also issues on the certificate management, and we are closely monitoring some of the work that's going on in the TLS working group and as well as in the ACME working group. And there's a draft also in CDNI working group that sort of bridges what are the specific commands you would need to use in order to use either the subcerts or the star based delegation method between the 2 CDN that are trying to use one of those mechanism for delegation. So some of that work, we're monitoring and then we are again providing feedback there. We're also looking at the ALTO working group. There are certain metrics that we can leverage. So that's really very a clearly defined path. But then there are some challenges as well. There are things that we are looking at. So basically, one of them is just the consistent interpretation of the video players on the browsers or any other way where the browsers do not necessarily, not the browsers, but the video players, I should say, do not necessarily always have the common interpretation of what has been laid out in the RFCs. So some of the work is really more practical and it's not something that the RFC necessarily need to change, but maybe there's more clarity that needs to be added. So we're looking at some of the work and see how we can bring that back as to what clarity is that we think is needed. There are other issues also with respect to bitrate shifts and the retransmissions because those both impact the QoE. And then the 360 virtual VR, we're looking at several different mechanism of how best we can address the latency issue because motion to photon is a big issue and latency is a big part of it. So these are the challenges, and I'm not sure if there's a clear path always defined to us that we can take it back to a specific working group. So that actually brings to our intent as to why MOPS, and we think that MOPS provide us a common ground where we can have a soft landing, bring some issues, and then seek direction as to where we need to go. Is there a working group that is addressing that issue, or is there a working group that may be willing to take that problem that we bring to as an issue that they want to work on, or maybe establish a new working group where the issue can be looked at. So these are some of the things that we think MOPS provide us a way to come back to bring issues and provide feedback. And that's all.
Thanks, Sanjay.
Sure.
Thank you, Sanjay.
Any clarifying questions?
Do we have a liaison to the SVA? Because that's what they sound like they need, is someone to help do that.
that answered.
We do not currently have a SBA liaison between the IETF and.
I'm sorry, I should have said Colin Jennings. Okay, I mean, would that meet some of the needs of knowing where to take feedback that was unclear to various working groups?
You want to answer, Sanjay? I'll
Go
throw
ahead,
mine.
go ahead.
Well, so my 2 cents are that it helps. It's a start. But one of the challenges too is that there's a lot of video-specific sort of expertise and knowledge that sometimes needs to be combined with those asks. And one of the things that we were thinking with MOPS would allow would be a concentration of that skill and expertise so that when these things do come in, they can sort of have a place to nurture and be developed, and then meaningfully, captured in IDs that eventually may flow into other working groups at the IETF, but they will have already been a little bit more mature with sort of a video technology expertise added onto them. Because in the past, a lot of times when people bring things in, they sometimes hit a group and the group doesn't quite know what to do with them or consume with them because they're not quite ready.
Yep.
And so that's sort of the thought here is try to find a way, as Sanjay said, provide a soft landing place for them so they can mature, percolate a little bit.
Okay, thank you.
Hi, Sanjay.
Emil?
Can you go back to slide 4?
Okay.
I have a clarification question, actually. When you speak about opportunities, are you speaking about opportunities for the MOPS charter? On the slide 4, you see there.
Oh, so I was just listing out from Emil.
Emil from Orange.
So what I'm looking here is that there are areas where SVA can basically forklift work that already exists. So these we see as opportunity. Clearly, there's some work that we can reuse. We don't have to reinvent the wheel when there's work that already exists. So just like the HTTP cache header response, I think that's something is very useful for SVA members to be able to use that work. So I think those are very clearly defined paths.
Okay, so it's opportunity for SVA, not
opportunity for SVA to be able to partner with IETF and reuse the work.
Okay.
And then the challenges are some of the things that may or may not have a clear path for us to go to. We don't know whether it's really a HTTP working group issue. The RFC 3986 that I reflect, we have had some conversations on that with the HTTP working group, and the RFC does not say anything. The RFC is clear, but it's the interpretation of what you take and what the implementation is that might exactly not mimic what the RFC was originally intending to say. So those are like a little bit of a finer issues that may not necessarily have that requires RFC 3986 to be revised, but maybe they can be a helpful document that sort of publishes what might be the guidelines to interpret that. So that is an area where we think we might be able to write something and bring it back to the IETF, because that's a challenge. That's something that's not a clearly defined solution that we see out there.
Yeah,
but we know that there are video players that are not always behaving consistently with respect to that, with respect to when they're redirected to the final source. They're not always able to maintain that session with that. They might actually go back again and then get redirected, so which means that you've lost some time in between.
I think I can also respond to the comment that this is good for the SVA, but what's in it for the IETF? If you put this together with the slide I showed about the work that SIMG is also doing on moving to IP-based networks, these are clearly groups that are making use of the work we do in here at the IETF. And instead of saying to them, well, hey, why don't you go do IETF networking work over in your place and then bring it back here potentially? It seems to make, at least to me, it makes more sense for the IETF to, with its expertise on IP-based networks and all the stuff that goes around it, to do the work here in one place and get it right, especially with the expertise of the IETF, and then let these other groups, whatever they do with it, consume and make use of it.
Yeah, so there are two benefits for IETF, why. One is clearly, as you see here, that we have reused the RFCs and we've identified areas of improvement. So I think that really feeds back into the IETF. And second thing is that we still have issues that need to find a home, and it's not always easy to know where to go exactly. In this case, it was very straightforward where we needed to go.
And one of the benefits that might come from the IETF is getting some new people to come into the room if we have these things to work on here that are interested in, passionate about it, to come in and join the organization and bring some fresh blood into the IETF. Never hurts.
Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Sanjay. And next, I think we have Justin.
Hi, I'm Justin Uberti from Google. I've worked on the WebRTC domain for quite some time, but at Google we do a lot of video streaming, and some of the video streaming world and the WebRTC world is starting to come together, and I'll sort of talk about some of the things that are happening there. We just talked in the previous presentation about some of the challenges, and one of them is how to deal with low latency environments. I'll get right into that. Next slide. So this is a quick overview of like what you would consider to be like the latency streaming, the streaming landscape today and the latency budgets that are available. And you know, from the WebRTC side, you know, the fact that like 10 seconds is considered being low latency seems kind of crazy, but that is sort of some of the stuff that exists today. That for VOD content, which is sort of pre-recorded material, it doesn't really matter that much what the actual latency is. And we started seeing some of the challenges in things like online sports, where like people perhaps in an apartment complex, you know, have the experience of hearing their neighbors yell out, you know, cheering before they actually see what's happened. And this can happen just because of the physics of like, okay, where's their playhead versus like their neighbors? Did they have packet loss or do their neighbors? And so there's some desire to try to move everything toward the right. You know, not every situation requires this, but there are many cases where low latency is not just important, it's actually critical. Next slide, or right here. All right, so you know, this is our typical streaming, and for those of you who have been not asleep the past few years, like this is now like the vast majority of all traffic on the internet is you know, online video. And so there's some technical stuff here about exactly how this stuff is coded, but it's generally coded for like maximal picture quality and for easy ability to jump into the stream, for it to be seekable, you know, really at any point. And so there's this GOP group of picture size. There's you know, frames that depend on previous frames. We're called bidirectional frames. And the way this generally works is that, you know, the streamer basically is sending out chunks of a video. The player then downloads them ahead of time. Once it feels like it has enough video sort of stored up, it then actually can start playing that out, and then keeps downloading more and more chunks to try to keep you know, its buffer full, and make sure that the user never sees like a frozen picture because it has had an underflow. What this means though is it needs to build up a pretty comfortable amount of data to make sure that underflow never occurs. Usually this stuff is being transmitted over TCP, which means that there's head-of-line blocking. And so like one lost packet can cause a stream to stall. And so the player needs to be pretty conservative to basically build up this buffer to make sure it never runs out of data. Now, one of the great things here is that CDNs work really well here. There's a lot of things, and like, you know, in IETF there's some RFCs for this, where basically the streamer can just start copying basically chunks to the CDNs, or the CDNs can be, you know, pulling them from the streamer, and there's really not a whole lot of logic that's involved here. You know, so, the client wants a block, it asks for it from the CDN goes and pulls it from the streamer, caches it, then the next client that comes along can get that exact same block. There's not a whole lot of, I mean, there's a lot of stuff that has to happen, but it's mostly copying data. And even in the player, it's mostly just doing XHR and then pulling that data down and then passing it into the actual decoder. But what this turns into is all these various things, how it's encoded, how it's delivered, you know, the over GOP size, the buffer, it all turns into multiple seconds of latency. You know, and that's even in the good case. So next, or moving along, there's a sort of this growing thing of like these low latency scenarios. And so Twitch, people are streaming their game. They want to talk about exactly what's happening as they see it. They don't want to basically say, you know, be chatting about something and have it be like 5 seconds behind real time where they're talking about something in the past. There's this app called HQ Trivia, where basically there's this guy who basically announces trivia questions live over video, and then people have to answer. So the latency is really important because they're expected to answer in a very short period of time. And then this new service that Google is rolling out called Google Stadia, which is basically sort of Netflix for gaming, where you have a very simple client on your device, and the game's actually running in the data center and streaming down to the device. And I'll talk a little bit more about this. In terms of overall traffic, I did some quick math on this. It looks like this is about 1% of all the traffic that Chrome sees and growing. This is a category that I think is starting to ramp up, and there's a number of reasons why it's complicated and it's taking a while to get going, but I expect to see this continue to increase. There are a lot of things that are technically different here. The way the stream is constructed is different. There's typically no group of pictures. There's no bidirectional frames. Everything's designed to be the minimal latency. You have a single frame to start the stream, and then just delta frames from that. And then it's not delivered typically over TCP. It's delivered over protocols made for real time that don't have headline blocking, that can deal with losses, either WebRTC or RTMFP. RTMFP is actually used by HQ Trivia. And these things all, they can basically understand, what is the bandwidth between the streamer and the client very easily. And they can also have the status of every single frame that's being delivered, every single packet that's being delivered, and the client will communicate that back. And they can know if there's losses, if they need to re-encode a new frame based on what the client knows it has received, or if it has to retransmit or apply error correction, et cetera. It needs to be a little more complicated than the typical TCP streaming. There's often no playout buffer here that, if it runs out of data, then it'll just sort of try to send a message back to get a new frame and continue on. It won't try to build up this big buffer so it can have a very small amount of latency. But the main thing is, because of all this, the existing CDN technology does not work super well. That, there are all these sort of protocols that are different than what CDNs are used to dealing with, and there's no simple ability to just copy some files. That really any of these edge streamers need to be able to estimate the bandwidth down to the client. They need to deal with what happens if that client is now missing a picture. They need to basically be more interactive than today's CDN streamers. But what you can do if you do all this stuff right is you get sub-second latency. And so Stadia is perhaps the most extreme example of some of this. A typical PC game, in the best configured case, the delta between human input and stuff being displayed on the screen is about 100 milliseconds. And in the typical deployments where you see someone's game console and it's hooked up to some TV that's got motion smoothing and some audio receiver with DSP set to dance club mode, it can easily be 200, 250 milliseconds. And so Stadia today is delivering, about 150 milliseconds end to end. It's been, sort of tested, by actual people in the field. What actually is happening here is the game is being run on a data center machine. Input is being streamed up from the game controller to that machine, and then the actual video is being pushed down of the actual gameplay, to the device, which then plays it out just like any other sort of low latency video stream. And so that display can be super simple. It can be a streaming TV stick. It can be a mobile device. It can be a Chromebook. It can really be anything that can just display video. It doesn't have to have a super high-end GPU, which has been the requirement for high-end gaming, up until now.
I just have a clarification question. Okay. Kyle Rose, Akamai. So the 150 milliseconds to end-to-end, is that the round trip time essentially? Controller input and then...
The time between you hit a button until the time you see your character jump or move or whatever. So right now, sort of, a lot of video streaming is happening in the sort of single-digit megabit range. You see 720p at maybe 3 or 4 megabit. You see 1080p maybe at 6, 8, maybe even 10 megabit. The minimum for Stadia right now is 15 megabit, and the sort of recommended is 25 megabit. And that's for 1080p 30 streaming. The expectation is that this will get to 4K 60, and even at the Stadia launch event, they talked about doing 8K 120, which would be a 200 megabit sort of range. So this is kind of moving things in a bit further down the sort of latency critical and high end performance range. So how does this stuff all work? It's pretty complicated.
Sorry. One clarification on that. So those numbers you just quoted, the 25 megabits and the 200 megabits range, that isn't the pipe size that you need. That's actually the continuous stream size that's actually coming down the pipe.
Yeah, in the entire
second,
time. I mean,
every second.
it's not, there's some lumpiness, but it's not like you get it all at once and then it plays out. It's like, it's continuous. So Stadia runs over WebRTC, and there's a bunch of different things that happen, like the actual app, does RPCs over HTTP. The video is sent over typical WebRTC, which is SRTP over ICE. Then the game input is sent up over a data channel. This also kind of is loss tolerant. So it's got ICE and DTLS SCTV, which is basically the normal WebRTC set of protocols. But there's not a lot of off-the-shelf stuff you can use here. HTTP has gotten some wonderful things about all sort of load balancers and like front-end gateways and other things that, for basically scaling up a service. And not just Stadia, but really everybody's doing this by hand. They have to build like their own server stacks that handle WebRTC, and it's not a simple stack. People are having to do a lot of work here. So I think there's a real opportunity to try to bring the existing streaming world and this low latency streaming world together. And one potential thing here is if we can actually use some of what's being done in Quick to make all this happen nicely. Right, we've got H3 coming out, built on top of Quick. There's a lot of stuff that we could do with Quick's lossy things that we could use it to send datagrams for the actual control. And I think there's some ways we could sort of layer media on top of Quick as well. And so maybe at some point in time in the future, we could get a simpler protocol stack and then have some of the front-end servers that are basically doing Quick for load balancing, for horizontal scaling, for authentication, et cetera, to also be able to handle media streams. And I think this will make everyone's life a lot easier and kind of usher in, making low latency streaming not the sort of 1% case, but really like the majority case. So we can hope. Thanks.
Any clarifying questions before Justin runs too far away?
Hi, it's Bob Briscoe from Cable Labs. You focused on the protocol itself, getting itself low delay, but of course there's potentially other traffic there and there's queuing that causes it delay no matter how good the protocol is. And so I would have thought that's more a sort of media ops type problem than.
Sure. I mean, if you don't have, if your pipe is congested.
No, not congested, just other traffic there.
Well, sure. I mean, right.
Yeah.
I guess my point is some of these things are structural. That even if your pipe is, you don't have a lot of, other traffic there. Some of these things are just how the video is being coded, how it's being sent down. Yeah. You're just not going to get the performance you want. And so even in the best case, you're kind of out of luck. Certainly, if things are not ideal, even if you have some of this other technology, it's still not going to work great either. So that's its own set of challenges, and media ops, probably can consider how can we make that stuff work better too.
I mean, there's work been going on in TSVWG for 4 years on that, and it's nearly finished. With queuing delay for all traffic in the sub-millisecond range. So and that I'm from Cable Labs. The cable industry's going to be deploying it next year. As all the specs are written and everything. So I'm just sort of surprised you don't know about that. But,
well, I mean,
So 2 points I would argue. One, I think one of the important things out of this whole presentation was just sort of the getting an appreciation of the magnitude of the problem, et cetera.
The queuing isn't the only problem.
Very good point about why we need to have an opportunity to talk about these things in the general IETF so that there can be cross-pollination and pointers to other useful things.
Yeah, I mean, the queuing isn't the only problem. There's, all the other things. I'm just saying it's part of the problem.
Thanks.
Ronnie Evan, I'm curious about the bit rates that you have there, because for the low latency, it was like 25 for 1080p, but for streaming like Netflix, this is not the same rates. I mean, the bit rates that are needed.
Right. I mean, there's a few things that I'll combine here. One is that for the Netflix case, Netflix done an amazing job basically trying to get the most out of every bit. And they can basically go through and recode like every single chunk, with a bunch of different quantization and other parameters to get like, the ideal setting, because like once they do any sort of VOD thing, they don't need to do it again. Whereas like for Stadia, like every single frame is like the first time it's probably ever been seen ever. Also, like, there's being done by a set of hardware encoders. The typical sort of PSNR of hardware encoders tends to be a little bit less than like, the best offline or the best, offline, software encoders. And there's also just very low tolerance for artifacts like in this scenario too. And so the bit rates are a little bit higher for the same resolution, just given like some of those limitations.
Roberto Payon, to add to what Justin is saying, keep in mind that video is inherently stateful and gets all of its, or rather compression is inherently stateful. And video that we send over the internet is always compressed because otherwise it just won't work. And the less state you have to refer to, the less you can compress. So the shorter these delays are, the less effective your compression is. So you will always have an inherent trade-off between the latency of the delivery and the bits per pixel or pixels per bit that you can deliver. Separately, to address a comment that was made earlier, I want to point out that in order for these applications to work really well, we have to have an L7 and an L4 and below that all agree to do the right thing. And having an awesome L4 and an L7 that doesn't adapt or that doesn't work well across the multiple different surfaces that we want to attach to is still going to cause a whole lot of pain. And that's one of the slides that Justin presented earlier, right? So, I mean, these things are whole stack things because they are whole stack things. Thank you.
Sure. All right, and I think Jake, you're it.
Hi, Jake Holland. So I wrote a draft, a proposed work item for this working group. And so I was going to talk about that and some of the motivations behind it. I've named it MOPS taxonomy. So what I'm going for here is a doc I wish I had a few years back. And the point is to try to kind of cover the video issues that you encounter in networking and to give people a kind of overview into what we're looking for, and to be when you're making a new solution, to be something you can point at to say, I'm solving this problem in this way, that kind of thing. I thought that would be hopefully useful. So as an overview, the current draft has the first two sections. I think bandwidth is the biggest thing, the bandwidth requirements of video and media in general on the internet today. As Justin showed it, it's the vast majority of current traffic, but that's only the tip of the iceberg for the demand for the traffic. So I addressed that a little bit. And I talk a little bit about the congestion avoidance strategies. I think there's a couple other sections that could be added. I'd love feedback on whether conferencing should be a part of this, and maybe the kind of low latency use cases we just heard about. And then I'd love to have kind of a pointer to a page where we could maintain a set of implementations. I think that would be a valuable contribution to get people up to speed when they try to enter this space or they find a need to engage with it. So the bandwidth requirements, I go over just the kind of per receiver, what's necessary. I have a formula that I pulled out of a thing. How replicating the traffic addresses that, and the kind of different ways of replicating with the caching and multicast. Some of the effects and challenges that go with that, and a suggestion from Ali that's not in there yet is the live versus on demand, and also covering asymmetric links. And to reprise kind of the motivation behind this. A few slides from Prague. When you just do the math, 72 Akamai is one of the major CDNs on the internet. They published in December their latest record was 72 terabits per second delivered to end users. And when you just take the 40 megabits required to send a 4K standard traffic and you do the division, you get like 1.8 million simultaneous viewers is what can be supported at that kind of traffic level to set a new record if the entire platform is dedicated to sending that. And if you look at like how many viewers is 1.8 million viewers, that's like that's the audience size for the number 179 Nielsen rated program from last year. So it's just it doesn't really touch on what's needed today and what's needed even going into the future. These are the audience sizes for some of the larger events in the last few years, and the actual delivered online events that already are well over this sort of high-end achievable value for a single provider for 4K. So obviously these users are not receiving their traffic in 4K. How long that will last is an exercise for the reader, I guess. So yeah, but there's other problems also that are kind of worth going over and addressing. Some of the challenges that you encounter when you're doing ABR with reliable segment transport, how you run into how the network interoperates with the player that's trying to perform bitrate detection and the kinds of effects that this causes. Some of the maybe insights into network design that would make this easier, or things that people should be aware of when they're trying to put together their network or their player. And then the various kinds of feedback-driven streaming that responds to feedback from the player. There's also some space to talk about how to address the conferencing, what the latency requirements are, the multi-directional options. What is it going to look like in your network when you try to run these conferencing things, and when they start to scale up, when there's more people, how you can maybe approach how to estimate how much to expect. And likewise, the pointer to the implementations, like, is this something we could maintain in the IETF? Would it be valuable? I think it would be valuable, but there's some questions to answer as we do that. I think it would be a valuable contribution for a working group to address. And then just where to go from there is, I'm hoping for feedback. I'm hoping for, I feel like the working group would be worthwhile, but that's just me. So questions?
Comments, questions? People read the draft? Admitting you read the draft.
I was just trying to write down as you were going there. Can you just enumerate really clearly for me one time the things that you think the working group would actually do that be useful, like document the list of implementation stuff. I'm just trying to make a concrete list of that.
So this is one of the documents I think I hope would be worthwhile. What problems do we encounter? I think it would be I've asked for maybe I'd end up right. I don't know, but I would like to have a roadmap of the various different video solutions. I think that whenever I try to figure that out, I just get confused. I can spend a week on it and I still get confused. So this has been a challenge for me. I would love somebody to who kind of knows the space better to write that doc. I think that there are we have a working group, of course, for RTP. When you go there, then everybody's talking about all the video encodings. And when I want to, get feedback on well, what do you do with multicast exactly? And how does the network work? Then, I can go to Mbondi and they don't know what I'm talking about with video. And although they can tell me all kinds of great stuff about routing, but it's like, there's a problem here that's about media. That's about,
So I sort of think like we just had a little bit of that in the previous presentation from Justin, right? In that articulating what some of the different requirements of that kind of video are, whether it's, differences in terms of the impact or availability of options for compression, or whether it's, differences in terms of how, how much details matter, so on and so forth. So there definitely are different classes of video. It's not just like video is one big chunk of data.
Yeah, I'm also wondering if there's any solutions that don't have a home yet that could get some review here. And I mean, I don't know if HLS is in scope, right? But that is a informational draft. It's almost like an external standards body doing it that just doesn't exist, but is posting the information, right? So, but there's features that would be maybe valuable to have or not have in HLS, and to get some review on that, right? Is there a forum for kind of feeding that back? And the same for Dash? I don't know. But I think getting consensus on some of the questions about that, like when a problem is presented, maybe even just like statements that a liaison could make, I feel like would be valuable.
Sanjay Mishra, Verizon. So I think your document lays out the problem areas that needs to be looked at, but any thoughts on how you want to drive your draft as to what are the specific areas you want to focus on?
So the hope is that it can be given feedback from the other experts who know more than I do in many cases, that it can be a more or less complete kind of walkthrough of the currently understood challenges with delivering video over the internet and within networks. So I'm where to focus. I hope to avoid digging too far into how to solve the various problems and challenges, although maybe pointing to solutions to existing kind of approaches is worthwhile, but identifying the areas of that need further research, and that that's kind of where I was hoping to take it. If you have suggestions on a more useful document, that would be great.
All right, thanks.
Thanks.
Hi. Sorry. Tony Tower, Comcast. I don't know, I'm not sure. I'll sidestep where this fits into IETF, but as an operator, I think it's very useful to have some, well defined and somewhat agreed upon ideas of how to get these scaling numbers, because to design networks that we need to do this.
Everybody just kind of
it's needed.
finds out themselves.
I don't know if it's IETF, I don't know if it's somewhere else, some documentation. Very good.
Thank you.
So it's Kesan from Cisco. So you just pointed the uniqueness problem when you have millions of subscribers and 4K in video streaming for any live broadcast. So that may not work well. We could consider hub and spoke model. And I think some of the operators, they seems to be suggesting that they want to have some way to deploy. So looks like that needs to be captured somewhere. That's one thing. So then another fundamental thing with respect to multicast and 4K video, when you have any network, so you have to uniquely send traffic end to end, even when there is a topology change. So you should not, overload the bandwidth. If link utilization, that also need to be captured somewhere.
Okay, as like additions to the document, you think these are new areas to mention?
Defining some of the requirements that we may need to capture with respect to media handling. So I don't know like where to capture. So I'm just bringing the points.
I hope so. I'm not sure that the final text of the document, but yeah, I mean it's the intent would be to address some of these kinds of things. Yeah. All right, thank you.
Thank you, Jake. All right. So hopefully that's given people an improved sense of sort of breadth and depth of problem space and potential interconnection points for the IETF. What I'd like to do now is just to do a very quick overview of some of the material that we have put together for a draft charter for a potential working group. I'm fine with doing some discussion of it. In fact, I'd like to do a little bit of discussion of it. I don't want to get into wordsmithing because the point of this exercise at this point is just to sort of say, here's a straw proposal for the sort of thing we think might be doable as a working group. And then we can have more substantive discussions about whether or not people feel that there is IETF work to be done here and whether there's clarity in doing it and whether there are enough people involved to be able to do the work. That seems like a reasonable approach to people. Okay. So the draft charter is available here. You're welcome to quickly scribble that down or get it out of the slides and the meeting materials. I will step through some of the chunks a bit by bit here. First observation is that this is not, I mean, charters are not rocket science. We basically cobbled this together from previous work done for the MBOND charter and for the V6 Ops working group charters. Yeah, so this is the overview. I think this is pretty much what we've been talking about in general round numbers here today, that there's a lot of video going on in the internet. There's a lot of video being worked on, here as well as in other organizations. It would be beneficial if we could get better coordination between those activities, as well as awareness raising of potential solutions of which people might not be aware. And to do these things in a way that's actually sympathetic to the internet's overall design. So to that end, the purpose of the working group would be to solicit input on operational issues and practices, existing and proposed technologies related to the deployment, engineering, and operation of media streaming and manipulation protocols and procedures in the global internet, interdomain and single domain networks. So that's kind of an overview of where we think this sort of thing lands. I would take clarification questions or suggestions at this point. I don't really want to get into hyper wordsmithing at this point.
I want to make one comment, Leslie.
Sure.
So one of the common things we like to ask of the IETF is what problem does it solve? Because we shouldn't do things if there isn't a problem that it's meaningfully going to contribute to. One of the takeaways I've found in the last few years working in this problem space within the IETF and in other places like the SVA is that there seems to be this recurring problem. And we saw it a little bit in the Strata stuff, right? Or Stadia stuff, where there's all these pieces. And when you're trying to put them together to do something useful, you keep hitting little roadblocks and little weird things in that particular piece, especially on boundaries between one piece and another piece or a layer and another layer. And when it comes to video expertise of, well, why is that? And what is it about video that exercises that particular boundary problem and needs work? It's hard to find places to have that conversation. And it's also hard to find the expertise to solve that. And one of the reasons we have those boundary problems, and they get really exacerbated by video, is the pure volumes of traffic that are sliding over our networks all the time. So these little inefficiencies that we're willing to tolerate in other situations get exacerbated day in and day out by video. And as we start doing things like streaming full-blown 4K video for video games at low latency across the network, we really just pound the heck out of our protocols. And so part of the idea that I hear, and I see this in this draft overview, is the notion of it's a place where people who understand that problem and are feeling that scaling issues and those frictions between the pieces you're putting together to deliver a solution can bring that knowledge and experience back into the IETF, find like-minded people, write meaningful drafts, coalesce those ideas and those needs and those wants, and ultimately either work on it within the group itself or feed those needs as they've gestated and become well thought out, feed them back into other areas of the IETF for them to tackle on it and have a really concrete problem for them to work on.
Okay, Mike.
Okay. Darshit Thakur, Cable Labs. So first of all, I think I completely we support the idea of having there's enough work in here. In terms of I know you don't want to do wordsmithing, but just as a quick question. So I like the statement where it says that it's about all things that are related to media, which include video, audio, and other objects. So, which was one of the things I was going to talk about, is that there's also more work that goes just beyond video in terms of immersive media or AR, VR kind of technologies, which are all related to the streaming thing. Would that also be something that can be brought in here if the needs are the same or similar?
I think it's fair to say it's too soon to rule it out of scope. Yeah. Justin?
Justin Eberty, Google. So reading this, what I'm mostly interpreting this to mean is we're going to see how existing streaming protocols can be augmented by better interaction with the network and largely targeted toward network operators. Is that the right understanding?
I don't think that was the intention. I think it's more closely meant to be that there really is video on the internet. That's the operational part. What are the things? What are the issues that that is causing, and how do we address them? This group wouldn't be doing the new protocols if they are new protocols, but it might do some legwork to say, there really are no protocols that currently do what we need. There's not something that we can adjust. So how can we go off and do other work to do that? So I think some existing protocols, some potential for spinning up new work, or at least characterizing potential for new work.
Okay, that makes sense to me. I think I just wanted to reinforce the point that Roberto made earlier, which is that we'll basically have, probably some new protocol work happening and perhaps in some other group, but then that will actually have to be combined with how does that actually work with real networks?
Right.
So it sounds like we're good.
Right. Cool.
Yeah, Matt Stock, Limelight Networks. So, I think in general this is interesting. One of the values that we've seen with Stream Video Alliance and then potentially this is there's the technology components, and as Glenn mentioned, there's all these different pieces, but then there's everybody learning how to put all of those pieces together on their own. And when you're dealing with scale and interoperability at scale, everybody's choices, when you've got ambiguity, has impacts and ripples with everybody else. And often you've got that also in situations where we're all experts in a slice, but you need to be able to have an opportunity to gauge feedback from different layers in the tech stack, or even silos. And so that's where I think the value in this kind of a function is. Really, it's that opportunity to say, yeah, this is a good way to accomplish it. It addresses these particular things, and it's almost like a best practices and more, but certainly best practices.
Yeah, and I was going to comment when Glenn said it, and now that you sort of reinforced it, I'll comment now. It's not, I think, just about inefficiencies, and it's not just that when you're traveling at speed with video, you highlight inefficiencies. I think that we've seen that some of the current uses of video and are challenging some of the assumptions that were made, both in terms of network scaling, setting up, architecting your network, to Tony's point, and in terms of the actual protocols and compression and so on and so forth. But, yeah.
If I can make one comment on that, sorry for jumping the queue. One of the challenges I think that people sometimes don't get is that video on the internet is undergoing a constant evolution. And they'll look at something like, we've all been able to stream movies now for a few years and do it pretty well. And that works pretty well. You can say, well, there's no problems here. Its job is done.
Come to my house.
Jake's chart kind of showed, he was like way down the Nielsen tail for a show that, isn't a popular show. And it was consuming a tremendous amount of bandwidth for just doing that. The number one shows and the big events way up on that chart, we have a capacity problem. We have a scalability problem. The world of video that they're transmitting to is changing, right? It's evolving from just being playback of movies, which is a very simple experience. It's very linear. I push the button, I watch it, it goes back, it goes to the end. To we're doing now live sports, multi-camera live sports, and not just professional stuff. It's people themselves are streaming from their kid's soccer game, multiple camera angles back to grandma and grandpa. They're doing very sophisticated things in very high resolution formats, right? People are doing 4K, people are doing 8K on the internet. The data volumes are ridiculous, and so we're sort of at this junction point, I think, where we've gone from media like 1.0, which was sort of like really simple basic stuff we did years ago. We used to call it multimedia, remember back in those days? And then we evolved to sort of this media 2.0, which we're sort of in right now, which is I can play back a movie pretty reliably in a linear experience. And I think we're on this cusp now of like media 3.0, where it's a much richer experience, much richer data types, much bigger volumes of data, and people interacting with the media in more complex ways. And that's going to really start stressing and pushing the protocols and the boundaries and the network itself. And that's what frankly, I'm very excited about it, because I think it's an interesting time to be in, to see this evolution go on, but it's also going to create some real challenges for IP networks. And that's why I think this work is kind of relevant to the IETF, because we're the place that does IP networks.
Okay, so I'm going to cut the mics as they stand now, and then we'll move on to more of the charter stuff. So go ahead, please.
So Stefan Wenger, Tencent. I would suggest to tighten the language there a little bit, primarily to focus on the mass distribution of video, rather than something as broad as this, which arguably would cover things like point-to-point video conferencing, which has, from an operational viewpoint, to the best of my knowledge, fundamentally different properties than mass distribution. I see Justin's point that there is some convergence about the protocols in use, but still, you're just having way too broad a scope, I fear, at the moment with this language.
So thank you for that point. I'm not sure that that's specifically the right way to tighten it, but we can come back to that if we get to the point of wordsmithing. But thanks.
Tighten any way you wish, but
yeah,
but don't keep it overly broad.
Roberto Payon, Google. Sorry, now Facebook. It's been a long time. Anyway, I have similar fears. This is very broad, and I can give you a concrete case where I would try and figure out, or rather I would have difficulty figuring out where this would go. So let's say we create a partially reliable HTTP. I think it's obvious that you can extend Dash, et cetera, and start impinging upon the things that we're currently doing with really low latency, WebRTC, et cetera, with such a technology. But you could also use it for games, and you can also use it for regular object transmission. You can use it at proxies for eliminating head-of-line blocking, but not necessarily for video. So I think that in order for this particular thing to be successful, we have to have a really crystal clear idea of exactly what things land here and how they don't impinge upon activities in other places.
Right. So in that regard, though, I think, again, the hope and expectation is that if stuff lands here, it's largely from the standpoint of getting it vectored somewhere else. So if something like that did land here, then hopefully there would be expertise in the room to say, you really should take it to this working group. Yeah.
Well, and that's the essence of an ops group, right? It's versus the protocol development group.
Okay, so,
Oh, sorry, I just wanted to say, I mean, that's partly like a dispatch function.
yeah. Okay, so, yeah, goals as we have them listed, again, soliciting input from network operators and users to identify operational issues with media delivery in and across networks, to solicit discussion and documentation, always important to have documentation, of the issues and opportunities for media acquisition and delivery and of the resulting innovations. So, I mean, all of this really is, again, focused on the kinds of work that we envision doing here and, you know, some of which you've seen outlined today. Yeah, the only real potential area for development is point number 6, to develop tools, extend protocols, and provide operational and implementational advice that assists in media technology administration, diagnostics, troubleshooting, and deployment between and within native and non-native environments. What a mouthful. Again, not wordsmithing here, but the point being, it's not about developing new protocols so much as the best current practices and you know, analysis. Colin.
All right, so everyone's talking about the SVA. I'm here representing the SVA. Yeah, I think, you know, yeah.
No, that's fine. Go ahead.
Sorry, Jason Tebow, Streaming Video Alliance. Okay, so what you guys are doing here is great, right? So as another organization that's focused on streaming video and best practices and guidelines and specs, we really look to the IETF and SMPTE for things like this, right? Things that are technologically focused, right? There are lots of issues to resolve, technology issues in the workflow, like encoding and things like that. But the IETF needs or is doing what it's focused on, which is I would say protocol development, stack development, operational development, and things of that nature. I think what we need to make sure is that, you know, from my perspective, from my organization's perspective, that the IETF doesn't supplant or try to take over kind of what we're trying to do. So we need to figure out a way to work together to make sure that the IETF is focused on, you know, sort of the technological development that the SVA doesn't really focus on, and at the same time allows us to remain sort of flexible to approach the things that we want to approach while you guys are doing, you know, really kind of the in the weeds development that is, you know, internet engineering, which is, again, not something that the SVA is particularly germane to.
Okay, thanks. Let me try this again. Colin?
Can you say a little bit more? So I'm poking on the developing new stuff here a little bit. Okay, that edge of it. So, and a lot of that is done with extending. Can you say a little bit more about the BCPs in particular, how you'd expect those to constrain other work that happen in the IETF? Because that's usually how we use them. Like, what type of things comes up there?
So I think the notion there was best current practice in sort of the literal and not in the literal interpretation of the words, and not sort of a now we're doing standards track stuff. So for operators who have determined that here's a useful way to handle this type of traffic in our network, here's our current practices, for instance. Right.
Okay. Not
so not so much as
I think what you're. I mean, I have no problem with informational,
right,
you know, advice.
Right.
But things that are neither best, neither current, nor a practice are what
well,
we put in our
yeah,
BCPs,
no. So
right?
it's yeah. Okay. Yeah. So that's a fair point and definitely bookmarked for clarifying the text. It was not, at least in my mind, intended as a constraint on development of other work so much as a capture. I do think they probably are best, and they probably are current, and they probably are practices, but not BCPs.
Hey, I'd take any one of those three, so it'd still be worth publishing. So,
right.
Okay, and then on 6, I mean, when we start talking about, I mean, most of our work is actually done by extending protocols, not developing new protocols. Right. I mean, I think that's some of people's uncomfortableness comes around that type of space. So anything you can try and say to make this charter narrower and crisper around what the scope is, because right now I can't think of anything that isn't in scope, and that's never a good sign for a charter to me. Right?
Okay.
Ali Bergen on Jabber, a couple of comments. He wondered how many folks are in the room that are not regular IETFers, and to make this working group a success, working closely and together with a bunch of several other organizations is a must. So,
right. So,
well, to that point, so we have JT introduced himself from the SVA. Somebody who was trying to be here but had to go to a meeting in LA on some video stuff was the director, Thomas Bowsen Mason, director of standards at SMT, was also going to be here today. Unfortunately, he had to go to LA instead of Montreal. But the point being is that there seems to be this ecosystem of people out there that depend upon our stuff that have an interest in the stuff we're producing in here at the IETF. And one of the friction points I've heard repeatedly from a lot of people is finding a place to do that. And where do they go? Where do they land? And where do they find other things to talk about? Like they're like-minded that share their problem space. And that's part of what I personally have found very frustrating too, was hoping to find maybe MOPS could provide a landing place for some of those things to work on that are very, very video specific, but that will touch ultimately other things outside of the MOPS area.
I think Alyssa was next.
Alyssa Cooper. I think this is, it's a helpful list. It kind of mixes a few different things. And I think when the community goes to evaluate the charter, if they do, it might be useful to separate them out. So one thing is like goals in exactly the dictionary definition sense, but usually a charter would be a little bit more specific on like actual work items. And this list kind of intersperses these, right? Like which documents are you going to work on, or what kinds of documents, as opposed to like what kind of discussion you're trying to stimulate. And I think separating those into like a specific, like here's the work list versus like here's the loftier goals might help ease the path for this one. And similarly, I think because the mechanism that you have in the working group is the consensus mechanism, it would be useful to understand like which of these things do you expect to be working group consensus kinds of outputs versus like number 5, which I assume is more like something that people who happen to gather here will do, but it's not something where you need like the machinery of the working group to get it done. So I think making that distinction could be helpful. And then I would just echo Cullen's comment on point number 6. Like, I want to know which protocols you're extending, because like that's kind of the point of the charter, is to scope that. So if there are specific ones in mind, like that's great, and we'll make sure there's no overlap with other existing groups. But if we don't know which ones those are, then it's not really a scope limitation. So it gets a little bit trickier, I think, from a chartering perspective.
Sure, thanks. Ronnie?
Ronnie Evan. It looks okay, but in number 1, I was wondering, by users, you mean content providers or you mean end user? What was the meaning of users here? And because I think both of them are applicable. And I think that for number 6, I would expect to see, I mean, in the charter, we'll have to see which other forums are relevant for this work that we need to cooperate with. It's not the only one. I mean, there are others that are working in this area.
Yeah.
Thanks, Ronnie.
Stefan Wenger, Alyssa stole my thunder, but in addition, remove any mentioning of media acquisition. Don't make it too complex. Focus on the delivery.
Well, on that particular one of the growing things, especially for live streaming by individuals or even professionals, well, whatever it is, whoever's doing it, it's something that's really growing as a demand on the network. And so that's why acquisition was included when we wrote this, so that it isn't just about pumping bits from a server to a viewer, it's also about the capturing of the bits from the camera into the ecosystem and sending it to people. Or in the case of like the gaming space, it's the actual, the server pumping out the video from the game and delivering it at scale.
All this is understood, but you're just basically doubling your problem space because of the protocols in use are just fundamentally different. The requirements are different. I mean, it's
a good point, but the challenge, especially with live stream, which is incredibly growing on the internet, right? Is that the two things go hand in hand. And so I can see the argument for separate them and divide and conquer. The two of them have to work really well together. And so putting them in one place so they can work well together and as you develop the documents around them, it makes it easier to work and coordinate that effort instead of splitting them up and making them sort of fend for themselves and not have any coordination. So on that particular point, that's my pushback.
Warren Kamari, Google. So there was a question from the Jabber about sort of how many people here are not regular IETF attendees, like how many people came in for this. And I don't know if we ever actually heard an answer to that. Could we do something like a show of hands, or a, like how many people normally participate, how many don't, how many, if this were to actually continue, would stop participating, etc.?
Do you want to do that right now, or do you want to do that when we do general discussions of? All right. So I think the list of questions were, first of all, how many people here are not usual IETF attendees? Okay, okay, thank you. And then of those, how many came specifically for this or material like this? How many people came because, in part at least, because of this BOF? Right, so smaller show of hands. Then the onward questions are, if something like this, if work in this area was chartered, how many would expect? How many didn't just come to throw bananas? How many would expect to continue to attend and participate in the discussions? And not just of the people who are new here. Okay, so I'm seeing about a quarter to a third of the room are putting up their hands. Is that good enough for now? Sure.
I'll also point out.
I think another question.
Sorry, on that particular last point, to Warren, when I look at the list of people that are also on the remote attendees, I do see a number of people who I know do not typically come to IETF meetings. So I'm not sure how we count those, but I see a lot of people that have taken the time to join in.
And I didn't get a sense from the Meet Echo room because I can't see it from where I'm standing.
I think the other relevant question is how many from the people who go to the IETF also go to the other standard meeting that work with that, because that's also, it's the opposite side, but I think there are people that do others also.
Okay, so how many people here in this room today go to other media video related meetings on a regular basis? All right. Okay, so that's about as many people as said that they would continue to participate here. So that sounds good. Thank you.
Just one comment about the issue of the live streaming. I think we are now in a live streaming conference, right? Okay, so this is, I assume this is something also we want to address. I mean,
but I don't think we're at quite the same number of expected participants as Jake was outlining. I think they could probably handle us. Go ahead.
Media acquisition is or is not the same thing as ingestion or contribution. Acquisition has connotations of other things. I can pay money and get a license for some content as opposed to distributing. This might be wordsmithing, but it might not be wordsmithing depending on your intent. So I just want to bring this up, that a definition of that is really important for what we're agreeing or disagreeing on.
That's a good point. And by the way, it was not meant to be all that other stuff. It's getting the video, not the boilerplate around running video ingestion services or anything like that, or authorizations. Or that's an even bigger can of worms.
Okay, so thanks for that discussion, and moving on to the next chunk of the draft charter. For all of those points, sort of as some global scoping rules, we have that the documents should document media operational experience, including the global internet, interdomain, and within domain operations, and that media operational and deployment issues with specific protocols or technologies are the primary responsibility of the groups or areas responsible for those protocols, i.e. we're not trying to eat anybody's lunch. So it might be useful for us to provide input to those other groups, but again, as somebody said earlier, it's more like a dispatch function. You know, that's really interesting. You should go here, or let's work on the problem statement and we can ship it over to a different working group. Comments or thoughts here?
Chris Lemons from Comcast. There are the ship it off to another working group is particularly interesting to me. We've got whenever you put together a bunch of protocols, components, what have you. A lot of times you discover, in fact, Sanjay mentioned it in his presentation from the SVA. You discover places where you need extension points to hook them together.
Right.
And so making sure that we send off those extension point works to the appropriate working groups is, I think, going to be vital to the functioning.
Great. Thanks. And then the additional constraints, just that this is stuff the AD made us put in. No, yeah, there is some hope to have scope and tightness of scope in the working group, and future, extending that scope it would require further discussion. And if we don't actually continue to meet and discuss this stuff, then we clearly don't have any work to do, and we should just stop it. Go ahead.
Lenny Giuliano, Juniper. I'm also the co-chair of MOND. So hopefully it's one of the working groups you guys envision coordinating with.
We saw your charter. We copied from your charter, so we liked you that much.
We actually have licensed that, so overall, the proposed text for each of the items is, pretty vague and covers, I think it was pretty well said. It could cover everything. I think it would be good to have a little more specificity, because it just seems like it could cover, between the charter and the goals, seems like it covers everything. And as I read it, it's still not clear to me what it is. If I didn't know that I was in here and saw everything else, I wouldn't know what this group did, other than, it's not obvious to an outsider what exactly and specifically is the problems you're trying to solve. But overall, I would express a lot of, I think this is a great effort, a very useful effort. As Jake has said, there seems to be different kind of a Tower of Babel problem, where the network guys don't quite understand the video stuff, the video guys don't quite understand the network stuff, but we are thinking that we are coming up with requirements or solutions for each other that may or may not be useful. So a coordinating role by this working group would, by a working group like this, would be very valuable. And for example, in MOND, we have been, it's not your father's multicast working group anymore. We've been trying to update things to get rid of parts of the architecture that are not very useful, and make the world safe for multicast. And we would love to have more feedback from groups like this to say if this is useful, if the work we're doing is worthwhile, because we're trying to do it for groups like folks like you. So I would hope that, and likewise, we would love to hear and better understand the challenges and the things you're looking for from the network. I think this is great work. I would love to, and we have a meeting Thursday. We'd love to, invite you guys, if you want to speak to our working group, to give an update about this effort and create a little bit more awareness.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks.
On the point you raised about it being very broad is this, we have this dichotomy. It's the challenges that video touches everything in the network. It touches routing, transport, package. I mean, every little piece, almost every work group. I mean, recently people were coming to me asking for, help with time stuff, and I thought time had been sort of settled years ago, and bam, it's back in droves. And so part of the challenge here, actually, we've tried to face in writing this stuff is how to capture the fact that it really does package all the pieces that we do with the IETF together to do the work it does. So the answer is, well, what's in it? Everything is in it. But where's the scoping? Where's the limit there? Well, it's around video. Everything's in it, but it's specifically limited to what you use those things to do for video.
So I'm going to say the same thing from a slightly different perspective. I think that part of our challenge is we have a very broad catchment area, even though I certainly take the point that, in order to be a working group that can get work done and make progress on it, we need some pretty specific focuses and deliverables and, concrete stuff. I think part of what you get out of focus in MOND and V6 ops and DNS ops and all these other things is it's protocol and what we're going to do with it operationally. We don't have one specific protocol that we're talking about, and that's a challenge. I mean, initially, I was resistant to the idea of the proposal of having an ops working group for this stuff, because I think it really is and remains more of an interest group type thing, a cross area thing, whatever. That's not really a working group per se. not really a research group either. But the IETF just doesn't really have the right structure for that kind of a thing. So we're trying to get this shaped properly so that we can get some of the work done in the context of an ops working group. So I think the point is really valid, but I'm just articulating this is what we've been struggling with, and this is why it sort of looks a little bit like a dog's breakfast, because it's, we can't say it's specific protocol and operational issues related to it. It's this stuff and operational issues related to it. So help appreciated.
Sure. Well, I think what you just said, it encompasses everything. I think that's as clear a, explanation for, what this group could be doing, and maybe more, text around that, because that makes it clear what you're trying to do and why you exist. Looking at the text as it is now, if I wasn't in this room for 90 minutes, I wouldn't know what this group did.
Yeah, so maybe we can do some rewriting in sort of non-stilted language and then bash it until it is stilted enough. Okay. All right, Jake?
Yeah, Jake Holland. Just a clarifying question to the people who've expressed concern over the breadth of scope. Would it satisfy your concerns if it just had sort of a, it must be tied to media delivery? I mean, like that is the key point that we're trying to address. But like Leslie said, video and media, if you think of point cloud or something, right? It touches every part of the network.
I'm getting head shakes.
And it
doesn't do it for people. Doesn't do it for everyone anyway.
So it does get into every part of it, and there are solutions for video that touch on routing. So is it or on transport? Is this something that can be addressed by just saying the focus has to be on the solving a video problem of some sort?
Start with your name.
My Roberto. One of my problems here is that the things that I do to solve video are exactly the things I do to solve other domains. So if I want to solve gaming, for instance, and I'm not talking about the display part coming back, right? But just game state. It has exactly the same properties as video. It is potentially stateful. I need compression. I need to distribute it. I need low latency. I need time. In almost every regard, except for the fact that I'm generating pixels, it is the same. And so the suite of technologies that I would develop are going to be very similar, if not the same, at least in terms of the stack that we're dealing with here. Would that fall out of this group or in this group? Because if it fell out of the group, it would be a little sad because it's exactly the same technologies. Right? But if it falls in the group, it's also kind of difficult because what is the breadth again?
Yeah, no, I hear what you're saying. And I think I have about the same reaction in that I certainly appreciate the desire for crispness and focus, but I'm not currently.
You can't boil the ocean.
Well, it's not just you can't boil the ocean. It's that we haven't found the right cross-cutting way to articulate what it is that's in or out. And I don't think I'm going to get it standing here at the microphone. If anybody sees a lightning bolt come down from the sky, hallelujah. But in the meantime, I do think that it's worth at least getting some sense of the room. These are the questions from RFC 5434 that are guidance for whether or not we are ready to propose a working group. I certainly understand from the discussion we've had so far that we don't have a charter that people are willing to hum on, but I think that there are two separable general questions, one of which is, do people think that there's something here that the IETF should be working on? And the second one is, should we be forming a working group? We'll probably stay primarily focused on the first part today, because there's more than word tweaking to do for the second part. So just in general round numbers, and I guess we can start with a hum and then have some microphone time. Do people here feel that there is a problem that needs solving and the IETF is the right group to attempt solving it? So go for a hum for yes. And go for hum for no. All right, that's good news. Colin.
I will add, that question is very interesting. I know where it came from. Right? My problem is I don't think if we ask these people what the problem is that needs to be solved, they can articulate it. That's the essence of every presentation today. So I agree, there's a problem that needs to be solved, right? I don't know we've articulated it yet. So that's
Yeah,
just
I think that's
a small to-do list.
Well, Colin, maybe I point out that in itself is sort of an indicator that there's a problem, that there's a sort of a common theme here. It's video. I'm touching all these things. I've got bandwidth problems. I've got protocol frustrations, and at some point, trying to bring that energy together to do productive work.
Sure. I would totally say that, but the problem to me is that we have many complicated things. There's no expert in single one. We need a common place that brings all those people to talk about their different technologies together, and they don't need to produce anything. They just need to talk about it, right? Like that's the problem to me. I'm sure that's not the problem to everyone else in the room, but clearly there's a problem. I mean, obviously,
Well, I'm glad you say it's obvious because I'm using this meeting to put a stake in the ground to say that it is obvious because prior to this, not necessarily been clear to everyone that there is an IETF workable problem here. So the next standard question from 5434 is, do we believe that there is a critical mass of participants willing to work on the problem to write drafts, blah, blah, blah. That's a little harder to answer given that we may all be thinking about different problems at this moment. But I think a legitimate question to ask at this point is, are there people who envision that they would be willing to not just attend the meetings, but read the mailing list and help write drafts as they came along? Jake's already ahead of us. He's got a proposed internet draft and some text. So the question to back it up is, and I think this will be a show of hands, one rather than a hum, who here would be willing to participate in the mailing list and possibly write some drafts in this area? All right. So I'm seeing a good dozen hands anyway. So we,
I'd say probably closer to 20 hands.
okay. All right. Closer to 20 hands. So I think that there's interest, there's willingness. And I think the next thing to do, because I don't think anybody here is going to agree that the scope of the problem is well defined and understood, let alone that there is agreement that the specific deliverables of which we've articulated none are the right ones. I think go ahead.
Well, just narrowing scope, and Lenny Giuliano from Juniper. Is it video or is it media? Meaning, is there non-video media that this group is looking to coordinate? If not, should it just be video and videos tangentially?
What do you call games? What do you call game stuff, right? Is that video? If it's interactive, is it media or is it video?
Oh, I'm sorry, what was it? Games?
Yeah.
Oh, games. Well, if it has video, I would call it video.
So yeah. So I think
is audio video?
What I'm saying is
video has audio in it.
Yeah, video and with its,
So I think part of the challenge is that
audio comes with it.
Is that I'm not sure that it's a helpful distinction to try to say, is it video or is it media? Because anytime you touch video, it's probably encased in some kind of media delivery or some piece of it is media.
This is really simple, I think. I don't want to wordsmith and give names, but the problem is not G723.1 4.3 kilobits per second speech codec stream. And the problem is also not 100 kilobits per second AAC audio stream. The problem are these multi-megabit streams. Yeah, and those are. So
the problem is multi-megabit streams that may or may not have the same characteristics and expectations as the previous multi-megabit streams that we had. And in that light, it becomes media more than necessarily specifically video. That's some of what I got out of what Justin presented.
Understood, but what I meant is we can, I think, reasonably say the problem is this video stuff, compressed samples, and entirely too many compressed samples, right? And how they were created and whether they are bundled with audio or not, it doesn't matter. Yeah, it's multi-megabit isochronous type of stuff.
So the point I think what you're trying to say is, if I can play it back, is that the little tiny bits, that's not what this is about. This is about the big chunky things that are really hard to manage, that are stressing the infrastructure and stressing the protocols. And to get back to the video or media question, so media sometimes is this lovely catch-all to sort of refer to both the video and the audio, and all the little bits and pieces that get packaged around, even if it's data objects. That's media. Video is a piece of the media. Does that make sense? It's a conceptual thing to get your head wrapped around, but it's sort of what a lot of people that talk about media all the time.
So maybe we should just call it the Big Unexpected Data Operations Group.
Big data.
So Justin, I think you were first.
Yeah, Justin Uberti, Google. I think a bunch of big data blobs might not be quite the same problem. Background file copies could conceivably fall under that lens, and that's a totally different type of problem. But just to try to maybe add up to what Stefan was saying, that this is not small audio VoIP streams, but I don't think we should paint ourselves into a corner with a video. One other exemplar you might want to consider is that this is a point cloud coming from a LiDAR array on a vehicle that's being remotely operated by a driver sitting in some data center.
So Colin Jays, I just say, and not, I was arguing scope it down here, but just so I had to boil the ocean. So all the things, so Justin's talking about maybe, 20 megabit streams and up, right? But you have all exactly the same problems, the same issues when you're running 256 kilobit streams of video in a stadium over a wireless network and 40,000 people all simultaneously stream the same game. It's exactly the same problems. You'd want to be able to discuss that type of stuff. And, there's 12,000 satellites coming that are all going to change our idea of what networks we need to work across very soon, and it's going to be a different bitwidth set there. And
Okay, so
I
earlier
wouldn't rate it by bandwidth only.
but
it's sort of overwhelming.
yeah, but Stefan earlier suggested that we talk about mass video delivery, and would your 256 kilobit
Sure,
fit
I
into
think
mass?
mass is different depending on what network you're on, right? But it is. I'm fine with it.
So it's weight then, right? Because it depends on the gravitational constant.
It depends how crappy your network is, right? I mean, that's
right. Sorry, Jake.
Buy more routers.
Jake Holland, I just wanted to say that it's not just about the size of the stream; it's also about the latency requirements and the
Right.
real-time requirements.
Yeah. Okay.
Yeah, so maybe mass media operation. To give the sense of it's about volume, not just one single stream that's going from one place to another.
Yeah.
Maybe large or maybe small, but the concept of mass.
Yeah. So I resisted that earlier but I think that it may be the better path to refine.
Because it helps define what that scope is.
Right.
Hi, hello, this is John Google, without consulting with Justin. And I think we should think about defining a term. Let's call it foo. We might actually use video or data or video data, which is that we want to transfer stuff that contains at least a video component, may contain other components, and has some kind of timing constraints on its delivery. I think if we define such a term, we at least can use that term in the rest of the charter, because constraints on timing of delivery and the fact that it's video and therefore grows big are both important parts of the problem set that are represented here.
Okay.
Sounds almost like an important first draft of ID.
I don't think he was volunteering, but Sanjay?
I was thinking as a work item for the working group.
Sanjay Mishra, Verizon. So I think we've already hit a lot of points about, sharpening the focus. So I don't need to say anything more on that. But really, some of the use cases that keep coming up, and something that I know within the SVA, we are looking at virtual reality end-to-end delivery. And there are issues that come up, whether some other things that need to go into the SRTP. Where would the measurements be going so that you have an end-to-end sense of how you're delivering
Right.
So those are the issues that would come up. So we're not there yet, but I know that we're going to be hitting against some of these issues because whether it's a protocol, SRTP needs to be looked at, whether it's really where do I go with my measurements? There are many places to go on that and what we are measuring. So some of those issues are the ones that we would probably be bringing up here. And latency for VR is really it.
And compression is a whole other thing.
Of course.
Yep. Go ahead.
Chris Lemons from Comcast. When we're framing this problem, I'm hearing a lot of people articulating ideas about what we think it should be, what stuff is in scope. We're all trying to, annex some scope. It might be most useful if we start to, when we take it to the list or continue the conversation, if we think clearly about some specific things that we're going to declare out of scope. For example, somebody asked me when we came here, so is this about telephony? Right? Is a telephone call in scope? And I think there might be some people in the room that are thinking, well, yeah, obviously, clearly, it's media and it's being transmitted and has latency requirements. And other people are saying, no, these are small things. That's a solved problem. We don't need to include that. And so clearly defining what's not in scope, taking, scope and saying that's not there, that may be one of the useful approaches we can take.
Great, thanks. I'm thinking
Codecs are not in scope, by the way. Just in case anybody wants to bring. I'm surprised nobody's gone to the microphone and asked that. Codecs are not. We're never considered to be in scope.
So I'm envisioning a working group called Thrust, whether or not the pigs fly. Roberto?
Roberto Pay on Facebook. I just wanted to throw out a couple things that I haven't heard, but I think are implied, which is that what we've been talking about are stateful things, that they are consumed in real time, whether or not that real time is 10 seconds from now or whatever, it doesn't really matter. And they're session-based. When I watch a video, it doesn't matter if it's many small parts or anything like that, it tends to go together. If it's a game, again, it doesn't matter if it's made from anything sent by many people, it's part of one session. I'm just trying to throw this out here in the case that this is helpful in scoping things.
Okay, thank you for that. So I think we are pretty much at time, so I have one action item to ask of everybody, and then I will look at the ADs and see what they think. I'm thinking that it is time for us to move off of the GG list and make a new mailing list. So would people here be willing to, supposing the ADs support creating a new mailing list, will people here be willing to sign up to a new mailing list to pursue this discussion? All right, we've got people willing to sign up. Anything else? I will be asking about the blue sheets again. I know there's one blue sheet out there. Somebody's got the blue sheet, and I know there are some people who have not signed it. Eric, Warren, anything you want to follow up at this point? No, you look good. All right. So generally speaking, it sounds like there's a here. We're just not quite sure what it is yet. We'll work on that on the mailing list and hopefully make some good progress that way. So thank you very much to our Jabber Scribe and our note taker and all of our presenters, and thank you all for coming and having a good discussion. Thank you. And I still have blue sheets if anybody needs to sign, and here comes the other one.